Hello, and welcome to Dungeons & Drama Nerds, a podcast exploring the intersection of theater and tabletop role-playing games. Today, we're here to talk about TTRPGs that explicitly invoke leftist political ideology, and the different ways that manifests mechanically and narratively in the game across different systems. Before we jump into that, I must note that we are joined today by my comrade, Nick.
Hello. I missed comrade in there when I was looking over the outline.
I had to say.
Yep.
We're joined by Nick and special guest PB Berge.
Hello! Insert greeting here.
Hell yeah. What's up, gamers? PB, will you just tell us a little bit about yourself before we jump into the content of the episode?
Absolutely. I'm an assistant professor of experimental game design at the University of Alberta. I'm really privileged to work with a bunch of different tabletop game designers. I also make them. I study them. Percy and I have written about some before. You can read that out there on the internet. And I'm really excited here to talk about the shifting political landscape of indie tabletop making.
It's a crazy time to be doing so.
Sure
Yeah,
is.
we really picked a week.
as we record this in September 2025.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we're here because we're talking about the game Stillfleet. Nick, do you want to lead us into sort of our jumping off point for why we wanted to do this episode for Stillfleet specifically?
Absolutely, yeah. So as people have heard us refer to before, if you have listened to the episodes that came out before this, I guess, Stillfleet is a game that's written from a sort of deliberately and explicitly leftist position. Wythe Marshall talked about that when we interviewed him, the game designer of Stillfleet. And one of the things he said in that episode was, what if games were a little more self-interrogative about the kinds of experiences that players go through? Or, and this is kind of glossing something else Wythe said, why are we playing games where we conquer land and hire serfs to serve us? Why is that the end goal? So I think, part of the philosophy of Stillfleet is to imagine a world that's informed by Wythe and the rest of Stillfleet Studios' politics, which is very specifically this kind of commentary on capitalism and colonialism and the impossible double bind that I think we've talked about in several episodes about Stillfleet, of living on this space station that is entirely run by a corporation, so there's sort of no other game in town, and also the things that you have to do for this corporate to live, to earn your living for this corporation, are sort of awful, frequently kind of overtly colonialist things. And how do you navigate within that? What are the spaces for subversion, for resistance? When all of the system is set up against you in that way, how do you make your a less awful vision of the world manifest? Is that a good summary, Percy?
Yeah, I think so.
Something that really jumps out at me, I think there's two different things sort of at work here. I think one is, if we think about games like Dungeons and Dragons, there's a very specific sort of power fantasy that's baked into so much of fantasy role-playing that involves the way we think about and conceive of power in that game, where, and I've written about this before, power in Dungeons and Dragons is sort of reflecting one's ability to alter or change yourself, the landscape, and the people around you, which the fact that power in that game is entirely sort of predicated on your ability to warp, particularly the landscape, to deal damage to others. It sort of serves as, I think Jay Dragon has written this before, as kind of a kind of physics engine. That kind of framing of power, I think, really sort of sets up this relationship then to colonialism that we see played out in those games, where if the goal of the game is to amass power, then the goal of the game is to improves one's ability to control the world around you. And that in itself, like, lends to a very specific sort of play into those very colonizing tropes. And I think it's also not surprising that we're seeing lots of what we could call like punk games or anti-fascist games that are very invested in putting you in, as Nick said, this impossible position where you're having to sort of straddle the line between surviving in a system that feels uninhabitable while also resisting it. I think those games open up a really interesting can of worms, just in that they bring up the tension that we all experience when we play tabletop role-playing games, because we are playing a system, participating in a system that we are often in tension with when we're like, damn it, that's not what I wanted to happen there, or I actually would like to contest that ruling. And so, I don't know, there's some interesting like design opportunities there to play with and against both the system, lowercase s, and the system, uppercase S.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I was just going to say, I think it is interesting, and one of the questions I keep coming back to when I think about like a leftist tabletop role playing game is the question of like, do the game's politics sort of like want to live in the gap, or do they want to live in the mechanic, right? Is it in the fruitful void, or is it in the rules of the game? Because Stillfleet, to use just use it as an example, like has no mechanics for like pushing back on the worshipful company, as it's called. That's not really set up in any way mechanically. It's just like, yeah, you know, when you do jobs, you get rewarded, and you get more personally powerful for reasons I'm not sure there's like diegetic explanation for like why you learn new skills only after completing a contract. But it's interesting to me that is sort of different from something like, you know, I don't know this game super well, but something like Spire, The City Must Fall, which is like a role-playing game about rebellion, where it's like hard-coded into the game's gameplay loop, as I understand it. I haven't played Spire.
Yeah, I think the like idea of power and power fantasy is interesting in relation to like what a leftist game might look like, because it does strike me that of the like games that we've assembled as like potential examples of like systems that are explicitly sort of invoking anti-fascist or communist or anarchist or otherwise leftist ideology, there's like two common fictional positionings, I think, where either you are like as in Stillfleet, you're just like a guy who works for who works a shitty job that is like exploitative and bad. Like, you know, you're like a guy that works for Amazon, and like you are incentivized to continue working for this company because you are being made more powerful by doing it. Or you are explicitly a revolutionary who is actively fighting the system, and the game it is there is no real option given by games like Spire to not be like a capital R revolutionary. Although I think there are some playbooks in Spire that are like, oh, you have like, maybe you in the past were complicit in this, or maybe you have some kind of connection or tie, but like the game assumes that you are actively wanting to work against this in its narrative. And in Stillfleet, I think there is room for you to play a campaign where you are like, you just work for the company the whole time.
I feel like that would get dull, but yes, you
I guess
totally could.
I think that's a good assessment of the different kind of positions that the player gets put in, and I think it's really interesting to think about what are the specific power fantasies that these revolutionary tabletop role-playing games put forward, and how are those articulated by the mechanics and the fiction that the players are expected to move through. I think games like Spire, The City Must Fall. I'm also thinking of Brinkwood, The Blood of Tyrants, which is one I spent a lot of time in. I can also think Voidheart Symphony is another example there, where you sort of exist in a system, and from the start you are existing in opposition to it, and your goal is to dismantle it as carefully as possible. And I think it in some ways maybe allows players to enter that with some familiarity from fantasy role playing and be like, okay, I get in here, I get stronger, and I'm trying to, take down this obviously capitalist, obviously extractive system. In the case of Brinkwood, I have some critiques of that game, which we might get into at some point, but I think that's made just so literal because the way that they construct vampires as being a capitalist entity. The idea in Brinkwood is that vampires, the currency in this world of Brinkwood is blood silver, and there's this process by which they actually extract both blood and wealth from the impoverished classes, and vampires have many different ways of ruling and kind of wielding both soft and hard power over different communities in the game, and it's expected that you have to sort of adapt your strategies and do what you can to achieve liberation. A lot of the time, though, I think people who come into that game maybe expect something like D&D, that is, or even Blades in the Dark, something pulpy and exciting and getting powerful, and then they get really surprised when it's a lot of logistics of managing a revolution and like making sure that, like, okay, so you've liberated, this small town. How are you keeping those people fed? Where are your supply lines? How are you taking care of this? And it's one of those things where people are like, wait, this isn't the this isn't the power fantasy I wanted.
As like somebody who does anti-fascist organizing, I do wish that more people realized that like the bulk of revolutionary work is like how is
bureaucracy
is like great, we're all striking. Who's paying for everyone's health insurance?
Right.
How are we eating?
Yeah.
I'm actually, this might be a tangent, but having just become more like familiar for the purposes of this episode with the world building of Extreme Meat Punks Forever by Heather Flowers and Arabelle, I'm curious about Blood Silver in relation to, there's like world building in EMF that's like, in Extreme Meat Punks Forever, you live on the body of a dead god called Meat World, and you mine flesh and meat and nerves and tendons from within it to build mechs that you use to fight fascists, and also cryptids and monsters and devils. And the thing that it's like extremely pulpy game, like extremely campy and over the top in a very like specific and calculated way. But there's the thing that makes the mechs work is called mutagens, and it's like explicit that like they are extracted in a myriad like very horrible ways, but in order for you to like use the mechs to fight fascists, you have to like participate in this system of extraction. And I am interested in that in relation to like this blood silver, which it sounds like is not a currency that you necessarily rely upon the same way in Brinkwood, but I'm not super familiar with Brinkwood, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely points in Brinkwood where you need currency to do things. You needed to bribe people to like pay for supplies to, I think that much like Meat Punks, there's sort of this understanding that a true disentanglement from these extractive systems is impossible. And so instead it becomes about, where and how do you plug your nose and pay for something with blood silver? Where do you turn to a different, perhaps more radical option? I think in the case of Extreme Meat Punks, it's I'm so in love with the role-playing game. I think it's a beautiful homage to what is also a fantastic visual novel. If you haven't played the original by Heather Flowers and Ryan Rose ACI, they did incredible job with it. And I think a part of it is in the original, the digital version, the world was actually a lot less fantastic. You know very little. It's sort of assumed to be like a near future Earth. And there's a lot of things that are very analogous to the present day. But the thing that's always made very clear is that the meat mechs are kind of a horrible thing that arguably should not exist. But at the same time, like, you don't have an opportunity to really worry about that. You have to take care of you and the other queers in your party who are imminently going to be attacked and killed by the Fash, which is just what they're called in the game. And I think that sort of extends here to the role-playing game as well. I know there's some different incarnations and facets of it, for lack of a better term, but yeah.
I'm just thinking, I feel like that's such a recurrent theme in leftist organizing and games, as well as the sort of dialectic between I think it's the Audre Lorde originally, the master's tools will never tear down the master's house, and then on the flip side of that, a sort of general, okay, but what have we got though in our hands right now?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and we don't have to go super deep down this rabbit hole, in part because of its relation to recent events, but I think a lot about arguments that people have about gun control in the United States, and leftists who are like, hey, just so you know, if they pass gun control laws, they will be selectively enforced, and the only thing that you will effectively do is take away a weapon from leftist and anti-fascists that other people will still continue to use, and we have to think about what that does. It's not to say that one should or shouldn't do it, but it is how do these individual pieces work systemically versus yes, absolutely, I agree that XYZ shouldn't happen.
Yeah, I have thoughts there about the way that some of these games root you in a what we could call almost a morbid realism, where you're almost invited to kind of revel in how fucked up and inescapable it feels at times. And I do think that in itself is kind of a maybe a lack of control fantasy, this idea that the system is so this is just what it is, I have to earn my dollar, or I'm not going to be able to progress in the game, so I'm going to play into this. And I mean, thinking beyond even just tabletop role-playing games, we're seeing so many of these very pulpy, oftentimes party games that really rely on this trope. I'm thinking everything from even Among Us to Lethal Company to all of these other games that are effectively about you are stuck in an extractive capitalist system that does not value your life and you will die, but you're gonna have a blast screaming and watching your friends get killed first. So enjoy that. And I think we're seeing elements of that brought into tabletop role-playing games as well. And it's kind of funny because yes, obviously it's a critique of capitalist systems, but it's also I don't know. I think it's sort of inviting a kind of a playful engagement that isn't always critical.
Yeah, because it doesn't become. I don't know Brinkwood well. You've made me really want to get to know it because it sounds like it offers these hard choices as hard choices, but I am stuck on there's an escapism in defeat or in powerlessness, I think sometimes too, because it's okay, I don't have to make the hard choices if the system has already been set up such that the answer is there's no point in trying to avoid the hard choice. I think I read a book of essays about climate change once that ended with a really weird one that at the end was eat the steak. because like it's gonna be so bad. Like that was sort of like you may as well do what you like because like it's already so locked in and individual choices don't make much of a difference. And like I do understand that, but also I think there's maybe value in grappling with those hard choices, or even just imagining, okay, but what if what if we all didn't eat beef or whatever, and I was thinking about there's an escapism there. There's an escapism. I feel like the oddball out in our big list of things here is maybe Lancer, which is the more of the leftist power fantasy kind of thing, where it's like, no, there actually are good guys, and
they won. Yeah,
and they won, and and you're very powerful. And I can't, there's a part of me that is torn between thinking that's like, I guess I'll just say escapism, and I mean that with as little like value judgment as possible, versus like, is that also, is there virtue in imagining that particular future of like, yeah, the good guys might win.
I mean, I think it's a question of like what role does playing a TTRPG play in like whatever sort of broader goal designers who are interested in engaging with these themes and topics, like what exactly are they trying to do? And I think the different people who designed these games that we're talking about would all say something slightly different, because I think we can all be realistic about the fact that I don't much the same way that when people talk about like revolutionary theater, like in this day and age at least, nobody is like leaving the game table or leaving the theater and picking up a pitchfork and storming city, you know what I mean? Like nobody is actively incited to revolutionary action directly by seeing a play or playing a tabletop game, I think. And maybe I'm being negative, but I think that that's true. Which I think leaves the question of like, what are we hoping that tabletop role-playing games do in that regard?
Yeah, if I might, I mean, kind of intrude on that idea a tiny bit, because I think this is a little bit where maybe if we zoom out from the sort of in-world fictions and mechanics of specific games and look at tabletop role-playing games as a hobby more generally, I do think though that there is something to be said about the way that what we might call leftist politics, but also punk culture, zine culture, and movements towards other modes of just being in community and playing together and like trying to survive have emerged within tabletop role-playing games creative subfields, both historically and somewhat recently. I think it's pretty important and pretty telling that I mean, for many of us, obviously, creating tabletop role-playing games is usually not the only thing that we do to sustain ourselves financially. But for many folks, it is a way of almost doing like different structures of art cooperatives, different ways of creating mutual aid funds, whether that's a subscribe to my Patreon and I will send you a game a month, which is a really kind of beautiful thing that artists in other creative spaces will do for each other at times. And I think it's also no coincidence that we see tabletop role-playing games at the forefront of different collective fundraising efforts for things like supporting victims of the genocide in Gaza, all the way to like trans liberation movements. I think it's actually pretty telling that I think you're right, Percy, like nobody is going to play a tabletop role-playing game and be like, yes, time to join my local like communist militia. At the same time, though, I do think that people are participating in these kind of like alternative economies of games in ways that are actually impactful and meaningful. The fact that someone might make, for example, a game that is free and still include it in a bundle for a charity cause. Like there's something happening there where, you know, capital isn't being created or generated in the same way, but it is being mobilized. And I think that that kind of like matters when we think about the ways that different creative communities around these games are working together and moving and finding ways to survive.
Yeah, even like
I hope
the
that
big...
wasn't a huge rabbit hole. I don't know.
No. Even the like those giant itch.io bundles. Yeah, I think particularly these games feel also like home, like it strikes me that like if you look at the fan bases of many of these games, they are like largely like queer and trans and otherwise marginalized people, largely like neurodivergent people, who gravitate towards games that are not like imperialist power fantasies, I think is often true. And that has to like, that does mean something.
And I think there's something to be said there too about because a big part of the reason we see so many of those fantasies recreated over and over and over again is because they're very marketable. They're very familiar. They sell well. But if you're not selling your games, if you're making art to share with people that you know, then the opening to tell other kinds of stories and deeply personal stories and games for even just a couple of people really, really open up. And something that I've been writing about, you know, you were mentioning just the scale of some of these bundles that sell, and it's like, oh yeah, I want to support, you know, trans rights in West Virginia or in Texas, and I'm going to buy this bundle of 14,000 games. It's interesting because as a scholar, I'm currently working on a book project titled Unplayable Games, and I'm really fascinated by ways that play doesn't always look like, you know, sitting down, picking up a game and being like, I'm going to play this. What are the other ways that we play? And I think that's something where, you know, 99% of the games you buy in those itch bundles, let's be honest, you're never going to touch. You're never going to download them. You're never going to open them. But them being there in that bundle as a part of this direct political movement and statement, it's still important to the community, and it's still important to the way that we think about each other. And I think something I'm seeing more and more, especially on the more experimental side of tabletop role-playing game creation, is folks creating speculative games that arguably cannot be played at all. Games that cost, for example, $600 because somebody received a pissed off comment being like, I don't think your game's worth $5. And the designer replies, you know what, you're right. Now it's $500. Fuck you. But I do think there's something there to be like, you know, what is the value of art? I'm done asking. Here's what my game is worth. Here I'm going to give it to you for free. Ways people are sort of challenging some of those assumptions we have.
No, I think you are correct that there is like as an opportunity to gather, that is like an important as a thing to cohere around, particularly, I guess not for nothing, like a thing that is relatively innocuous on its face. If you're like, oh, this is my tabletop gaming group, the chances of a fascist trying to interrupt that is like lower than you being like, this is my affinity group.
Right.
But I also think there's like, as much as there's not maybe necessarily a direct invitation from Game Table to the Revolution TM, I also think there is something that White talks about a lot in the Stillfleet book, is just like the work of, particularly like thinking about genre, like many of these games we're talking about are science fiction games or some flavor of punk game, or like not very many of them are explicitly fantasy. Some of them are like, you could do fantasy, and I'm a little bit like, I don't know if you can. But they're all engaging with apocalypse in some way. Maybe not all, but most of them are at least engaging with apocalypse. And I think there is a degree of like, maybe even in an Augusto Boal-y way, like if you're playing a game where you are a revolutionary and you have to take this action, it's like, oh, okay, I'm feeling out what this actually feels like. Maybe not what this actually feels like, but I'm feeling out a flavor of what this feels like. Or in, I don't know, some kind of like cyberpunk game where you kind of have to do what you have to do in order to survive. I might argue that's a really good way to get comfortable with the feeling of like breaking the law, or like going outside of what you are like supposed to be doing. Like there is, I think, an argument to make too that these like fictional worlds are useful spaces for just sort of like feeling out what it is to have to acknowledge what it is to be in tension with the world in which you live, in the way that like I think many of us, if not all of us, experience in some way in real life, that is sort of like sharpened and intensified in the fictions of these games.
And it is also, I'm just thinking about what you were talking about with the community, PB, and it strikes me as well, like there's coming together around the table, and there is also the I get the sense, although I'm not like heavily involved, but I do get the sense that the indie tabletop sphere is one in which a lot of people like explore organizing in ways like itch bundles and that kind of thing. And you know, I think that's partly because I was also going to invoke Paul, partly because, you know, it is a space that's used to thinking about like other possible futures, and also, you know, more cynically, it's a space that there's not very much money in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's the powers that be have relatively little interest in like controlling it, and like theater, you know, which is my kind of home discipline, you know, it's a very difficult thing to contain because it happens live, and potentially unmediated, or you know, less mediated.
And if I not to go full game prof on main for this, if we link that historically, something that is really, really interesting is we go back to the earliest history of tabletop role-playing games. These were games that folks were creating for a couple of people, pen and paper, and in the best case scenario, the most successful ones, you were Xeroxing them, you were mailing them to folks. We were lots of play-by-post back in the day. And what's really interesting is this is happening shortly before we have this big moment in computer gaming where something really similar happens, and that is that folks are developing games, you know, on their very expensive university or research institution machines, and they're sending them to one another. Games are free, they're modifying one another's games, and a lot of people assume that history of games, you know, begins with Nintendo or begins with Gary Gygax. But if we zoom back, the history of games is the history of shareware. It's the history of people creating zines and compendiums and things for one another in these kind of alternative play spaces, and almost like a gift economy. And really where you bring in Gygax and Arneson and TSR is when somebody finally starts stapling those Xeroxed materials together and saying, I own this, pay me money. And I think that something very baked into the ethos of tabletop gaming is fuck you. Like, how are you going to control what I do with this? It's an idea and you can't have that. And it's really interesting to see, you know, in the context of things like the OGL scandal from a year and some change ago, to obviously Wizards of the Coast now moving us towards D&D 5.5, I guess the kids are calling it now, but for a while there they were calling it 1 D&D, this idea that we're moving towards a game as platform that we can maintain. And a part of the reasons Wizards is pivoting to that model is because, yeah, how do you control, how do you continue to extract capital from this thing that is sitting around the table with one another, telling stories and doing improvised role playing? You can't. And I think that within tabletop scenes, we're seeing a lot of folks now actually exiting like the video game industry and getting into tabletop, in part because they're so burnt out by the fucked up and exploitive practices of tech industries that they're like, okay, this little corner of game creativity seems to have figured something else out. Not perfect, and you're right, there's no money, but also there's no money. Yeah. Like in the same kind of controlling, you're going to get laid off the moment your game ships kind of way.
Yeah. It's a really beautiful thing, I think, especially in the indie tabletop sphere. And yeah, I hate the idea of game as platform. In general, and particularly for tabletop. I don't really play video games very much, so I know that has become increasingly the norm. I'm not that tapped into that, but seeing it kind of creeping into the edges of the tabletop sphere, I'm like, oh no, that's my favorite thing about this hobby, is that it happens, between me and you and me and you and me and you,
right?
Not on the servers of a corporation.
Yeah. I mean, something that brings me hope about it is, though, that, like, given this history and given, like, even if we understand that D&D is, like, a colonialist power fantasy in which you are engaging in behavior that you might ideologically disagree with, like, I'm not, if I encounter a bandit ambush, I'm probably not going to murder all of them.
I don't think I
can. That's also, I guess that's also true. Regardless, right? Like, there can, like, we all understand that there's some distance between what the game invites you to do and what we might actually do in that situation, because it's a game, whatever. I think there is also, like, many people that I know who have, like, strong ideological disagreements with the framing of certain things in D&D, just, like, change it. Like, there is, like, a hackability and a homebrew ethos that is, I think, fundamental to people who play tabletop games in general, because like, they can't stop you. Like, ultimately, if you're sitting at the table, you can truly do whatever you want at the end of the day, because it's not like the thing doesn't exist unless you are performing it or enacting it, and you can choose to do so in whatever way you want to.
To be clear, though, they'll try.
Yes.
They'll try to stop you, and by that I mean, like, if you rock up to an adventurers league or something, and you'll be like, hey, actually, I really don't love the way that, the Isle of Cholt is being framed here in Tomb of Annihilation. This is kind of actually super fucked up. Are we the baddies? I have a feeling, you might face some pushback. And similarly, when we think about even the things that, like the creative licenses that Wizards of the Coast imposes on people who create third-party content for D&D, there are some, like, really big limitations. And honestly, even just in what you are allowed to publish, where, one of the games we had earmarked for today is Rebel Scum, which famously got removed from, I believe it was Drive-Thru, and as a game marketplace, because they made the apparently incredibly violent decision to name the antagonistic system the Republic, spelled with a K, so that there would be lots of opportunities to say, I punch that Republican in the face. Now, of course, you can pick up the very unapologetic copy at your local game store, and they'll have a little note in there about, yeah, that's right, this is the game that got banned from Drive-Thru. But I do think there's something to be said, though, about, people willingly going out and picking up books like that and being like, no, like, this isn't something I'm going to try to, like, just hack into or homebrew into my game. I would be curious to see, if somebody tried to, I don't know, hack something like Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition into something genuinely anti-capitalist or progressive. I'm sure there are people who've tried.
I'm sure there's people who've tried. I don't know that I think it's... This is sort of what I was writing about recently. I'm like, I don't know that I think it's possible without hacking it so far that you've essentially just written a new game anyway. So why not do that?
Yeah.
I think it would be funny though to be like, here's my Dungeons and Dragons hack in which I've excised the majority of the mechanics.
Yeah. I think the leveling system in and of itself is very difficult to extricate.
Yeah. I mean, I think something that has struck me about looking at our different like sort of example games is that like it doesn't seem to me that there is like a leftist mechanic. Like it doesn't like I actually don't think that it is like like I don't think that this sort of point of view about our relationship to the world and what we might want to do in order to make it better, whatever that might mean to us, I don't think that it is reflectable in the mechanics of a game, because ultimately I think like I just don't know that you can do that. I don't think there is like I can't find an example of a mechanical way that's reflected.
I was gonna say, I do think there are patterns, definitely, that we see. A couple, though I agree, I don't think anything is necessarily uniform. I mean, a couple of things that I do think we're seeing more and more. Just straight up front is anti-fascist statements. What I think some folks have called the Olivia Hill rule, because I think she was one of the first designers to kind of put that into a couple of games, particularly with I Hunt, if I'm remembering right. And I hope my game etymology here is correct. But we see that in games like Thirsty Sword Lesbians. We see that in games like Revel Scum. Putting something up front that just says, hey, like, if you support genocide or colonialism or white supremacy or queer phobia, like, there is no space for you at this table. That in itself, I guess we could call that a mechanic. Hey, fuck off, fascists. Like, it's a sign on the door at the very least. Yeah. And the other thing that I do think is really, really integral to games that are interested in exploring leftist politics is to put the player in some kind of tension with a toxic power. And if we're maybe comparing that to something like Dungeons and Dragons, where the goal is to sort of amass power, kind of no matter what, then I think the idea of making it clear that power is toxic in and of itself and complicating that relationship becomes something really important. Where I know in games like Brinkwood, the more powerful your character gets, also the more like scarred and fragile they become, and the more kind of like dangerous to the stakes of the revolution they become. In particular, I'm also thinking of Thirsty Sword Lesbians has a move in the game that is call upon a toxic power, and the move itself kind of lays out the different stakes of like, you can do this, and this is a very powerful move. But this is going to change the fiction, and this is going to challenge your character. And so it makes it very clear that this isn't just an ability you have. This is a resort you can turn to. But I think the thing about Call Upon a Toxic Power that makes it such a powerful storytelling tool is that watching players try to avoid using that until they have exhausted their other options. Yeah.
And I'm thinking about that tension that you're talking about, PB, is one of those things where it's, there's a part of me that says like, well, I feel like maybe it's less leftist game design than just like leftist play, because in principle, it should be possible to more. I mean, I do agree that like, as written, the what D&D is set up to let you do is like acquire power, but also, as written, D&D doesn't really incentivize you to do anything very much because it's such a broad like market that's trying to cater to. And like I feel like somebody could set up a tension with a toxic power in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. The real downside is that the game doesn't offer you any support in doing that, right? Like all falls on the players to like play into that tension and the GM to like set it up in such a way, whereas Thirsty Sword Lesbians like architects that a little bit into the game as it like expects you to play.
Or even like it might just be as simple as the difference between like many of these games that we are looking at have an explicitly stated end goal in a way that D&D doesn't, and like
right, exactly,
and or other games I can think of that are, I would say, not leftist, are like the goal is like kill the supernatural horror that is threatening you, or exterminate this other source of power, even if the explicit goal is not amass power. But like Tomorrow Revelation 3, which is by friends of the pod, CJ Linton and Dominique Dickey, the game puts you on a spaceship with floors that are like class separated. So like the upper class, like the high class, like administrators are on the A, and then it goes down. But the explicitly stated goal of the game is to like change the station until it's a place that you would like to live. And it's not really prescriptive exactly about what that means, but it is like very strongly implied that like the capitalist corporation that has created this class stratified space station is bad. And I think it might just be as simple as the difference between like saying explicitly, this is what you're trying to do. Even if you're creating a game that sort of goes up to the moment of revolutionary success, rather than like waiting to see what happens after that, because I haven't played Spire, but it strikes me that like it is so focused on like the moment of completing that goal and is not necessarily mechanically built to accommodate like, okay, what's next?
Yeah. And I do think there's a lot to be said about world building games here too, that sort of offer okay, well, like, what is your imaginary of like what could come after? And like I really believe that tabletop games and role playing in general is like so important for that speculative work that is like imagining possible futures that could exist, which is like the worst thing you could do in a world shaped by capitalism and colonialism. To that same end, Percy, one game that I think really nails this same kind of tension, and it does it phenomenally, and I'm gonna geek out about it for a minute and y'all are gonna forgive me, is Ray Najati's Apocalypse Keys, which is founded on the premise vaguely Hellboy-esque of you are monsters working for the government to hunt down other monsters and stop them from ending the world. It's also, strangely enough, a largely like investigative game. You're not like, although there is often violence, it's definitely not the centerpiece. It's mostly you are going out to regions of the world, talking to other monsters and humans, trying to figure out what the big bad evil thing of the week is and stop it from sealing or unsealing rather one of the doors of doom and ending the world. But the thing that the game does super well is in its fleshing out of the government agency you work for, which is called Division. It is made very clear that you are also under surveillance by this agency and that they are only using you because they absolutely have to. And the way that power is set up in that game is the more powerful you get, you accrue these points called ruin, and once you hit a certain amount of ruin, Your character becomes more powerful as the monster that you are. Eventually, the only way, conceivably, to kind of retire your character in the fiction is to accrue enough ruin that you become the next harbinger of the end times. At which point, the game master or the keeper takes your character sheet. You are now the antagonist of the next mission. Roll up a new character. But something about that I find really beautiful is, even though it isn't set into the fiction, or at least it wasn't when I was running mostly the playtest. I haven't read some of the newer supplements that have come out, so maybe they've gotten to this finally, but every time that I have run Apocalypse Keys, I think I've done 3 or 4 different campaigns now, it inevitably ends with the monsters turning on the division. It's something that I think is so baked into the system and the tensions that are inherent to each of the missions that you go on, the characters that you're meeting. The moment you start asking hang on, are we the baddies? You're like, yes, we are definitively the baddies. And if we don't change who we are and how we're playing this game right now, then we are going to be fighting ourselves. So something I think that really the most kind of impressive games in this area can do is actually prompt the players to challenge the game structures itself, and to turn on the narrative framing and the mechanics and be like, you know what? What if I didn't work for you? In fact, what if I embrace my role as harbinger of the end times? What might this game look like?
Which is similar to how Stillfleet works, where both of them I think are fruitful voids of there is no text that actually I think in Stillfleet they do say maybe you'll turn against the company, who's to say? But there's no mechanical support for how to do that, and there's, as Nick mentioned earlier, no mechanical reward or incentive for doing that. But similarly, it does seem like in both games, the inevitable conclusion you are led to is this is an untenable relationship that must end. Yeah. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, and I was going to say, and it puts me very much in mind, I just dropped this on our outline earlier today, so I don't know if either of you had a chance or to look at it or are familiar already. Game designer, I've never had to say his name out loud before, but I think it's Zedek Siu. Who's a Malaysian game designer, has this thing on his blog called How to Play the Revolution, which in short basically suggests maybe the only way to really play the revolution, at least in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, is to get up to, you mentioned before, Percy, the point of revolution, and then he suggests just then stop playing D&D because the rules will not work for you anymore there. I think what you were saying, PB, about Apocalypse Keys putting you in this tension where it's if we keep playing the game, just executing this gameplay loop, we will become Division's next target.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting and fun idea of okay, so how do you get people to actually revolt against the game system? It's you've made me very excited to check out Apocalypse Keys, which everyone is talking about lately, even though it came out 4 years ago. I feel this week I've had 7 people mention Apocalypse Keys to me.
Well, I'm glad it's catching on. I mean, yeah, I really enjoyed it when I got to play it, even back at the playtest. But something I think, actually, to this point, to the point you're making, Nick, I became really interested in Apocalypse Keys when I was doing this study on self-destructing and self-immolating games and Doom games, where the ending is actually fixed and you will lose if you continue to play. A really great example here being Stephen Dewey's 10 Candles, which I maintain is one of the greatest tabletop role-playing games ever made. And I think something about games like 10 Candles, where you sit down the players at the very beginning and you're your characters will die. That that challenges the impulse for the power fantasy, the gamer in you, the I'm gonna get the best ending, I can save them all, I can do it all, and it really throws a wrench in that, and it makes you ask different questions about like, what kind of character do I want to play, what do I want this to look like, but I think there are also a lot of cases where it really opens up then opportunities for players to challenge the game itself. It challenges the primacy of the game and its rules. I know there were some conversations around, and sorry, this episode is becoming a long ludography of different titles, even though I promised I would try to contain myself. I can't. There was a lot of conversation around Mörkborg, the Swedish death punk role-playing game that has become now a cult classic, because it operates in the genre of the OSR, and people were like, well, is this just another like vaguely medieval fantasy game? Like, how can this actually be anything progressive at all? I think something people or maybe underestimated about that game is the power of telling the players, actually, you're going to lose. You are going to die. The world is going to end. And then you have to burn the book. Like, you have to set this on fire, and that is the last component here. Not only does it, I think, kind of undermine the authority of the text itself, which, for most fantasy tabletop gamers, the rows and rows of books on the shelf are the like symbol of cultural capital and power and prestige and establishment. It also, invites players to adopt a different relationship to rule systems. In some ways, I think challenging the rule system in a role-playing game becomes a part of us thinking about, well, what are the other cultural rule sets I could potentially challenge in my day-to-day life?
Yeah, and how much more meaningful it is to reach that conclusion on your own in games like Apocalypse Keys and Stillfleet, as opposed to that being a prescribed gameplay loop. I haven't read this before, Nick, but now I'm really interested, especially in the thing that the pieces the How to Play the Revolution, which is responding to the idea that like mandating ethical behavior in your game actually makes it unethical, which is like an argument that we don't have, that can of worms we need not open. But it is, I think, an interesting distinction between like you're incentivized to be a good person because there are mechanical benefits for it, which opens up the question of like, well, how good are you being and how ethical are you being if you're doing it for, whatever. But I think there is something really exciting about that relation to rules that are present in some of these games. Not for nothing also because PB and I have spent the spring and early summer thinking about the relationships between players and the rules of games.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an important point, Percy, where it's like, I think when the game mechanically structures for you how to participate in the revolution, and that is what it rewards, that's one thing. But I think games that are that welcome rebellion against the gamic system itself create some really interesting opportunities to think about what's possible there. I know, Percy and I wrote a bit about Caamano 1's game Lamprey in an article recently, which, for those of you who don't know, is a game. I would actually describe it as an anti-game, which is a personal fascination of mine. And to play it, you effectively take a different role-playing game text and you tear pages out one at a time. And the rules of game Lamprey are that any pages that have been torn from the source text no longer apply. So it is basically a slow decomposition of other texts. And, some people are like, oh, that's a shitpost game. But it's actually like a really interesting way of thinking about, well, Like, am I just shredding my other tabletop RPGs, or am I playing game lamprey? And what does it mean to find play in the active dismantling of these other rule systems? Anyway, I wish we would see, I mean, I hope we continue to see, rather, more designers exploring that very productive space that can be created by encouraging players to be vandals and criminals of their own, and I guess also others, game systems and works.
Well, and like of relinquishing the need to, as the designer, mandate the player's experience, which is, I think, a leftist position in relation to game design, rather than saying, I am creating an experience that you will have, saying, I am creating a relationship and a world for you to be in relation to that is then yours to take over. Feels different to me than like some other games that I can think of.
I'm so delighted that you invoked Game Lamprey, one of my favorite tabletop role-playing products. I've just been browsing. I don't mean to harp on it, but I did want to circle back, because what I love about Game Lamprey is that it is totally playable and incentivizes play. This is what I was trying to remember, because it lets, when you tear a page out, it lets you succeed at something in the game it's in.
Yes.
Right? Is the gimmick. So it's like, it is totally possible to play D&D, and whenever you rip a page out, you get the equivalent of a natural 20. I think it's such smart design. And I also am seeing now that, for everyone should check this out, it's by Caamano 1. And the last page says, "Why would I do this?" And
it's so funny.
It's written, "Look, I'm not here to answer that question for you, just to hand you a lamprey."
Yeah. And not to get all, I don't know, me about it again, but I do think we're seeing more and more of these, what I've described elsewhere as anti-games or speculative game projects coming out. And I think a lot of it is because folks are interested in exploring the space for play out, like, not just outside of game economies, but outside of game. Like, what happens when I've burned away my source text and have nothing left to play? What happens when I've torn all the pages out? Like, what do I do? And we're seeing, lots of games in bundles now that are actually just poems or manifestos or Word documents or recipes for kimchi. Like, and I don't think that's just like anarchist shitposting and like the more experimental edge of the hobby. I actually do think that it is folks being like, I'm done being dictated to what the boundaries of game are by specific cultural actors. I am going to embrace my own imaginary for what a game can be, and I'm going to find a way to make these other things playful and kind of dramatically expand our horizons that way. It's really exciting. And I think the running question for this podcast can be, is Game Lamprey a leftist game? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I don't even know if y'all have comments. I don't think there are.
You can skeet us on Blue Sky.
I was going to say, email your hot takes about this directly to Percy and Nick, please.
Yeah, find my email address.
I was going to say, text Percy at...
No. You're not going to get a prompt answer if you send me a text message. Actually, that is a lie. I'm actually remarkably prompt about email and text, and it's the only thing that I'm prompt about. Anyway, I feel that that's a wonderful place for us to leave off.
I agree, yes.
Is Game Lamprey a leftist game? / what happens if we stop needing games in order to play? And may we all dispense with imaginaries imposed upon us by by systems, TTRPG, and otherwise.
Here.
Incredible. Well, thank you all for listening to Dungeons and Drama Nerds, the podcast that we are on. I'm a podcast professional. Thank you all for listening to Dungeons and Drama Nerds. We will be back in a little while with some more actual play episodes of Stillfleet for you. So tune in then.
Please leave that whole thing in the final cut.
100%.
Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Percival Hornak and Nicholas Orvis and co-produced, mixed, and edited by Ben Ferber. Our game of Waith Marshall's Stillfleet features Christopher Diercksen as Geshra Beetle, Kory Flores as Peanut, Mieko Gavia as Kiranis, John Johnson as Private Taps, special guest Waith Marshall as Charik Shadams, and was GM'd by Ben Ferber. If you'd like to help us continue exploring the intersections of theater and tabletop role-playing games, consider leaving us a review on your podcast app of choice or supporting us on Patreon, which gets you access to our patron-only bonus content, including our patron-exclusive show, Skit Bash. You can find us at patreon.com/dungeonsanddramanerds. You can find our social media, website, and cast bios at the link tree in our show notes. Our core ensemble members are Todd Backus, Jovane Caamano, Anthony Sertel Dean, Christopher Diercksen, Ben Ferber, Kory Flores, Mieko Gavia, Tess Huth, Romana Isabella, John Johnson, CJ Linton, C. Meaks Meaker, Leo Mock, Phan, and Tristan B. Willis. Tune in next week for another exciting episode.